Graybridge was the kind of city people forgot existed. Tucked between a river and a stretch of old highways, it was quiet, predictable, and safe. Too safe, some said. Crime reports were rare enough to make the local newspaper feel thin. People waved at strangers. Store owners left signs outside overnight without fee. In Graybridge, danger felt like something that only happened in big cities shown on late-night news. That belief shattered on an early October morning. The air was cold but calm when Mrs. Helen Crawford stepped into the hallway of her apartment building on Maple Street. She was 72 and followed the same routine every day without fail. Wake up at 6. Brew tea. Check the mail. Greet the morning with a quiet smile. But that morning, something felt wrong the moment she opened her door. The hallway light was on. It was always off at that hour. As she walked toward the stairs, she noticed a door standing open at the far end of the hall. Apartment 3B. Laura Bennett's apartment. Laura was a young graphic designer who worked from home and rarely spoke to anyone. Still, she always locked her door. Everyone knew that. Mrs. Crawford called out Laura's name. There was no answer. She stepped closer, her heart beating faster with each step. The smell hit her first. A strange mix of cleaning chemicals and something else she couldn't place. When she reached the doorway, she froze. Laura Bennett was lying on the floor. The police arrived within minutes. Red and blue lights painted the quiet building in harsh colors. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in disbelief. No one screamed. No one cried loudly. The shock was too heavy for that. It was as if the entire building had stopped breathing. Detective Aaron Cole arrived shortly after. He was in his early 40s, tall, with tired eyes that had seen more than most people in Graybridge ever would. He had transferred from a larger city years ago, hoping for a quieter life. He got his wish, until now. He stood in the doorway of apartment 3B and took everything in. The room was neat, almost unnaturally so. No broken furniture. No overturned chairs. Laura's body showed no obvious signs of violence. Her face was calm, as if she were asleep. But people didn't die like this for no reason. Cole noticed the windows were locked. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The kitchen sink was empty, wiped clean. Even the trash bin had been taken out. Whoever had been here had time. And they had been careful. The coroner arrived and quietly confirmed what everyone feared. Laura Bennett was dead. Time of death was estimated sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. The question was simple but terrifying. How did someone enter and leave without leaving a trace? At first, police considered natural causes. Laura had lived alone. There were no immediate signs of trauma. But something didn't sit right with Detective Cole. His instincts, sharpened by years on the job, told him this was not an accident. He noticed Laura's phone was missing. People don't usually hide their phones before dying. They don't clean their apartments either. As the body was taken away and the building slowly emptied, fear settled into the walls of Graybridge like a cold draft. By noon, news of the death had spread across the city. By evening, rumors followed. Some said Laura had known her killer. Others said it was a robbery gone wrong. A few whispered darker theories, but no one wanted to believe them. Graybridge had never faced something like this before. 2 weeks passed. Life tried to return to normal. Flowers were placed outside Laura's apartment door. Her name appeared briefly in the newspaper, then slowly faded. But Detective Cole couldn't let it go. He reviewed the case again and again, searching for something he might have missed. Then the second body was found. This time, it was across town in a small duplex near the river. The victim was a man in his 50s named Daniel Moore. He was found on his couch, television still on, lights fully lit. No signs of struggle. No forced entry. His phone was gone. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Cole felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. 2 deaths. Same strange calm. Same silence. Same missing phone. The city officially entered panic mode after the 3rd death. People began locking their doors earlier. Porch lights stayed on all night. Social media filled with fear and theories. Some blamed outsiders. Others blamed the police. Parents warned their children not to talk to anyone they didn't know. Graybridge, once peaceful, was now wide awake at night. Detective Cole worked longer hours, sleeping less. Each crime scene felt like a message, carefully written but impossible to read. The killer wasn't messy. They weren't angry. They were controlled. That scared him more than anything. By the time the fourth body was discovered, the word serial killer was no longer whispered. It was spoken out loud on television and printed in bold letters across headlines. The media gave the unknown murderer a name, something the public could fear and remember. They called them the Night Watcher. Cole hated the name. It made the killer sound powerful, important, but he couldn't deny that it fit. Each victim had been found under bright lights, as if the killer wanted them seen. As if the darkness wasn't enough. Late one night, after hours of staring at case files, Cole sat alone in his office. The city outside was quiet, but not peaceful. He stared at the photos of the victims lined up on his desk. 4 faces. 4 lives ended without warning. He realized something then. The killer wasn't rushing. They were patient. They were confident. And they were still out there. As dawn approached, Cole looked out the window and watched the lights of Graybridge flicker on one by one. The city was awake again, but it was no longer safe in its sleep. The Night Watcher had changed everything. And this was only the beginning. By the time the fourth body was discovered, Graybridge no longer felt like a city. It felt like a trap. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but something invisible had wrapped itself around the town. Fear moved quietly, slipping into homes through locked doors and closed windows. People slept with lights on. Some did not sleep at all. Detective Aaron Cole felt the pressure growing every hour. The fourth victim was found in a modest apartment complex near the old train tracks. Her name was Rachel Donnelly, a 40-year-old librarian who lived alone and kept mostly to herself. A co-worker became worried when Rachel didn't show up for work 2 days in a row. When police entered her apartment, they found her lying neatly on her bed, hands folded across her chest. The bedroom light was on. The living room light was on. Even the bathroom light glowed softly. It was as if someone had made sure darkness never touched her. There were no signs of struggle. No bruises. No forced entry. Once again, her phone was missing. Cole stood in the doorway for a long time, his jaw tight, his thoughts racing. 4 victims. 4 clean scenes. 4 missing phones. Whoever was doing this knew exactly how to avoid leaving evidence. They weren't sloppy. They weren't impulsive. They were deliberate. Back at the station, Cole pinned photographs, maps, and timelines across an entire wall. He studied the locations again and again, searching for connections. The victims lived in different neighborhoods. They worked different jobs. Their ages varied. There was no shared friend, no shared routine, no shared past. At least, not one that was obvious. For days, the investigation stalled. Leads went nowhere. Tips flooded in from terrified citizens, but most were useless. People reported strangers walking dogs, unfamiliar cars parked too long, shadows moving at night. Fear turned everyone into a suspect. The media made things worse. News vans parked outside the police station. Reporters asked the same question every day. Was there a serial killer? Were people safe? Why hadn't the police caught them yet? Cole avoided cameras whenever he could. He didn't have answers, and he refused to lie. Late one night, while reviewing reports for the 100th time, Cole noticed something he had overlooked before. It was small, almost meaningless on its own, but it bothered him. The lights. At every crime scene, all the lights had been on. Not just one room. Not just the area where the body was found. Every single light. Most killers tried to hide what they'd done. This one did the opposite. Cole wondered if the lights meant something. A message, perhaps. Or maybe a habit. Maybe the killer didn't like the dark. He began rereading witness statements, looking for anything related to lighting, power, or maintenance. That was when another detail quietly rose to the surface. Each building had recently undergone minor repairs. In Laura Bennett's apartment building, hallway lights had been replaced 2 weeks before her death. Daniel Moore's duplex had electrical maintenance done days before he was found. Rachel Donnelly's building had an elevator light repaired shortly before her murder. It wasn't proof. But it wasn't coincidence either. Cole leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his bones. He knew better than to chase theories without evidence. Still, His instincts whispered that the killer was not breaking in. They were being let in. That thought chilled him. If the killer had legitimate access to buildings, it meant they could come and go without raising suspicion. They could walk hallways without fear. They could knock on doors without causing alarm. They could be anyone. Then came the fifth murder. It happened on a rainy Thursday night, the kind of night where the sound of water masked everything else. The victim was a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Hill. She lived on the third floor of a quiet apartment building near downtown. Her daughter called police after Margaret failed to answer her phone for an entire day. When officers arrived, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, the apartment was spotless. Too spotless. The lights were on, as always. Margaret Hill lay on the living room floor, her glasses placed neatly on the coffee table beside her. Her phone was gone. But this time, there was something new. A neighbor had heard something during the night. Not a scream. Not a cry for help. A cough. The neighbor, a college student who lived across the hall, told police she woke up briefly around 2 in the morning. She heard what sounded like someone coughing in the hallway. A dry, strained cough. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. At the time, she thought nothing of it. People coughed. Old buildings echoed. She went back to sleep. Cole listened carefully as the statement was read aloud. His heart beat faster. It was the first sound ever linked to the killer. The first moment where silence broke. The cough suggested a presence. A physical flaw. Something human. Cole requested security footage from nearby buildings and traffic cameras. Most showed nothing useful. Faces were blurred. Figures were distant. But one camera, positioned at the entrance of a parking garage across the street, caught something interesting. At 1:47 a.m., a man walked past the camera. He wore a dark jacket. His head was slightly down. He didn't look at the camera. He walked calmly, without urgency. In his hand, he carried a small bag, like a tool bag. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify him, but it showed something important. He didn't run. Killers often fled. This one didn't. As the investigation continued, pressure mounted. City officials demanded results. The police chief reminded Cole that public trust was fading. People wanted safety. They wanted arrests. Cole wanted the truth. He began to believe the killer lived close to the victims. Someone who blended in. Someone who belonged. The idea that the murderer was an outsider no longer made sense. This killer knew the city. Knew its buildings. Knew its routines. One night, Cole sat in his car outside a crime scene long after everyone else had left. The building lights glowed softly in the rain. He watched residents come and go, their faces tired, fearful, alert. He wondered how many of them had walked past the killer without knowing it. How many had held the door open? How many had smiled? The most disturbing thought of all crept into his mind slowly. What if the killer enjoyed being invisible? What if being ignored was part of the thrill? As Cole drove home in the early hours of the morning, he noticed how many lights were on across the city. Windows glowing in the dark like watchful eyes. Greybridge was no longer sleeping. Neither was its killer. And somewhere in the city, a small mistake was waiting to be made. Greybridge was exhausted. Weeks of fear had worn the city down, turning simple routines into tense rituals. People checked locks twice. They watched shadows more closely. Every unfamiliar sound felt dangerous. Yet, in the middle of all this fear, the killer moved freely, unnoticed, hidden in plain sight. Detective Aaron Cole believed the answer was already in front of him. He just hadn't learned how to see it yet. After the fifth murder, Cole shifted the investigation in a new direction. He stopped focusing only on victims and began studying access. Who could enter buildings without suspicion? Who could walk hallways at night and not be questioned? Who could knock on doors and be welcomed instead of feared? The list was smaller than he expected. Maintenance workers, electricians, cleaners, delivery drivers, people whose presence explained itself. Cole requested records from property management companies across Greybridge. At first, the amount of information was overwhelming. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of work orders. But patterns slowly began to appear. One name kept resurfacing. Evan Miles. Evan was 34 years old. He worked as a contracted maintenance technician for multiple apartment buildings. His duties included checking lights, repairing elevators, replacing locks, and responding to late-night calls when something stopped working. He had keys. Sometimes master keys. He worked odd hours. He was trusted. And most importantly, no one remembered him. Property managers described Evan the same way. Quiet. Reliable. Polite. He showed up, fixed the problem, and left. Tenants rarely complained. Some struggled to recall his face at all. When Cole pulled Evan's work history, the connection became difficult to ignore. Evan had been assigned to buildings linked to 3 of the 5 victims. Not on the exact nights of the murders, but close enough to raise questions. Still, coincidence was not evidence. Cole ordered background checks. Evan had no criminal record, no history of violence, no restraining orders, no suspicious financial activity. He lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. He paid his rent on time. He didn't socialize much. On paper, Evan Miles was invisible. Cole decided to interview him. The interview room was quiet and plain. Evan sat across the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He wore a simple jacket and kept his eyes down. He answered questions softly, carefully choosing his words. He said he enjoyed working nights because it was quieter. He said he preferred being alone. He said people made him uncomfortable. None of that was a crime. Cole asked where Evan had been on the nights of the murders. Evan answered calmly. He had been working, sleeping, watching television. His answers were ordinary, boring, exactly what you would expect. Then Cole mentioned Margaret Hill. Evan nodded slowly, as if recalling something distant. Yes, he said. 3rd floor. Apartment near the stairs. Cole felt something tighten inside him. The detail was small. Too small to matter to anyone else. But Cole knew that information had never been released publicly. The apartment number, the exact location. Only police and the killer would know that. Cole asked Evan how he knew. Evan hesitated. It wasn't long. Barely a second. But it was real. I fixed a hallway light there, Evan said. A few weeks back. Cole kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. When Evan left the room, Cole immediately checked the records. There was no work order for that apartment. No assignment. No report. Nothing. The mistake was subtle. Almost invisible. Just like Evan himself. But it was enough. Cole didn't arrest Evan. Not yet. There still wasn't proof. Instead, he placed him under surveillance. For the next several days, officers followed Evan quietly. They watched him go to work, visit hardware stores, and return home. He followed routines with mechanical precision. He ate alone. He avoided crowds. He never spoke more than necessary. At night, he walked the city. Sometimes he carried a small tool bag. Sometimes he didn't. He entered buildings without hesitation, using keys that opened doors smoothly. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. Why would they? He belonged there. Cole watched footage from surveillance teams with growing dread. Evan didn't rush. He didn't sneak. He moved as if he had every right to be wherever he was. One evening, Evan stopped outside an apartment building connected to an earlier victim. He stood in the hallway for several minutes, listening. Then he turned and left. It was like watching a hunter decide whether to strike. Cole's frustration grew. He knew Evan was the killer. He felt it in his bones. But feelings didn't hold up in court. Then the breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A forensic technician reviewing old evidence noticed something strange about the missing phones. They had all been powered off around the same time after each murder. The shutdowns occurred in areas with weak signal coverage. The technician overlaid the shutdown locations on a city map. The points clustered around one neighborhood, Evan's neighborhood. Cole ordered a search warrant. When police entered Evan's apartment, it looked ordinary at first glance. Clean, organized, sparse. But closer inspection revealed something disturbing. Behind a loose panel in the bedroom wall, officers found several phones. 5 of them, all belonging to the victims. They were wiped clean. No messages. No photos. But their presence was undeniable. In the bathroom cabinet, police found gloves, cleaning cloths, and a small bottle of prescription sedatives. The name on the bottle had been scratched off. Evan was arrested that night. During interrogation, he remained calm, almost relieved. When Cole asked why he did it, Evan didn't answer at first. He stared at the table, his expression flat. Finally, he spoke. "People don't see me," he said. "They never have." He explained that he watched people from the background. Tenants ignored him, walked past him, held doors without looking at his face. He learned their schedules, their habits, their loneliness. He said he chose people who lived alone because no one would notice the missing right away. He didn't see himself as cruel. He saw himself as necessary. "They were already alone," Evan said quietly. "I just made it permanent." Cole felt a chill run through him. Evan didn't kill out of rage, or money, or revenge. He killed to feel visible. And for a long time, the city had helped him do it. As Evan was led away, Cole realized something deeply unsettling. The killer had never hidden. He had simply been ignored. And if not for one small mistake, he might never have been caught at all. The arrest of Evan Miles sent shockwaves through Greybridge. News outlets splashed his face across television screens and online feeds. People in cafes and grocery stores whispered his name as if saying it aloud could summon more terror. The city that had learned to fear the night now feared one man, and the unsettling truth that he had been living among them, invisible, unnoticed, for years. Detective Aaron Cole sat in his office, staring at a photograph of Evan taken at the time of arrest. It showed a man who could easily blend into any crowd, unremarkable brown hair, a plain jacket, a calm expression. Nothing about him screamed monster. And that was precisely what made Evan so dangerous. Cole had read case files of serial killers before, studied the methods and psychology, and yet nothing prepared him for the quiet, methodical calm of Evan Miles. He had never encountered a killer who didn't crave attention but instead craved invisibility. Cole spent the next days poring over every piece of evidence, every report, every interview. He wanted to understand Evan, to know how someone so ordinary could commit atrocities so precise. The more he dug, the more the picture became clear. Evan wasn't sloppy. He wasn't impulsive. He planned. He observed. And he chose his victims with meticulous care. The first breakthrough came from Evan's own words during interrogation. He spoke slowly, calmly, almost as if explaining a hobby rather than confessing crimes. He told the detectives that he began killing because he had always felt invisible. People overlooked him at work, in the grocery store, on the streets. He was ignored, dismissed, treated as unremarkable. To him, life had always been a series of shadows. He watched others, noticed patterns, memorized routines. Loneliness fascinated him, and he saw a twisted form of justice in selecting victims who were already alone. They were already invisible to the world, he told Cole. "I just finished the work. I just made them permanent." Cole listened carefully, taking notes. There was no remorse, no anger, no fear. Just calm, almost clinical explanation. What made it worse was the clarity of Evan's logic. He didn't see himself as evil. He believed he was solving a problem, delivering peace to those who lived unnoticed. Evan described his methods in chilling detail. He would scout buildings weeks in advance, noting which apartments were occupied, which residents were frequently away, which doors were rarely checked. He observed lighting patterns, schedules, and security habits. Using his access as a maintenance worker, he would enter buildings with master keys or during times when his presence wouldn't raise suspicion. He brought with him a small toolkit containing gloves, cleaning cloths, and sedatives. The sedatives allowed him to immobilize his victims if needed. But in most cases, he relied on the fact that no one would resist. He had calculated the odds. No one would notice him. No one would stop him. It wasn't just his planning that was frightening. It was the precision. Each murder scene was staged to appear peaceful, almost serene. Lights left on. Floors clean. Objects carefully arranged. He wanted the victims to be discovered in a state of calm, untouched by chaos. That same detail had baffled detectives for weeks. Cole realized that the calm of the crime scenes wasn't random. It was Evan's signature, his way of controlling the narrative of death. The stolen phones were another piece of the puzzle. Evan kept them hidden behind a panel in his apartment, meticulously wiping all data to erase evidence. Phones were more than property to him. They were trophies. Each device represented the life he had taken, a small token of the invisibility he had experienced. Yet even here, he was deliberate. The phones were never damaged. They were preserved. Evan didn't destroy life carelessly. He curated it. As investigators combed through Evan's apartment and storage, more evidence emerged. Hidden in a locked drawer, they found notebooks filled with observations, details about tenants, schedules, habits, and routines. Notes about whom he had seen walking alone, whom he had observed for weeks. It was methodical, obsessive, and entirely devoid of empathy. Every detail served a purpose. Every observation led to a calculated decision. Cole realized that Evan's greatest strength had been his ordinariness. He had no criminal record. He had no violent history. He lived alone, kept to himself, and presented no threat. People ignored him, and that invisibility had allowed him to operate under the radar for years. Every small detail of his life had been designed to reinforce the illusion of normalcy. Yet, the flaw that ultimately led to his capture was almost laughably small, a slip of knowledge. During an early interview, Evan casually mentioned Margaret Hill's apartment number. Police records had not released that information to the public. The pause that followed when he was asked how he knew was enough to alert Detective Cole. That one tiny mistake shattered Evan's carefully constructed world. Once surveillance was placed on him, the police observed behaviors that confirmed every fear. Evan moved through buildings with ease, using access no one questioned. He stopped at doors, listened, and sometimes paused in hallways, seemingly assessing conditions. The calm, deliberate nature of his movements indicated premeditation, but also confidence that no one would intervene. Cole realized that the investigation had been aided not by a slip in forensic evidence, but by Evan's human tendency to reveal himself in small ways. Even someone as meticulous as Evan could not eliminate every risk. And in the end, it was his own words, his own casual comment, that became the key. The interrogation continued for days. Evan spoke at length about each victim, detailing his observations without emotion. Detective Cole felt a strange mixture of horror and fascination. There was no malice in Evan's tone. There was only satisfaction in having executed a plan with precision. It wasn't about hate, Evan said one afternoon. It was about being seen. Finally, being acknowledged. I chose those who were ignored, like me. I wanted to show the world that I existed, even if it was through my actions. Cole felt a chill. Evan was dangerous not only for what he did but for how calmly he rationalized it. He had no remorse, yet he understood every emotional impact of his crimes. He had empathy in the sense that he knew exactly how people would react, just not for the reasons everyone expected. The investigation revealed more unsettling truths. Evan had planned his actions to avoid detection not just physically, but psychologically. He manipulated perception, ensuring that neighbors and building staff viewed him as ordinary. His calm demeanor, polite interactions, and reliability were masks that hid the predator underneath. His invisibility was deliberate, and because he was unnoticed, he had operated undetected, right in the heart of the city. The police also discovered that Evan had studied crime reports and media coverage of serial killers. He knew the mistakes others had made and ensured he did not repeat them. He avoided impulsivity. He avoided leaving evidence. He avoided patterns that could be easily traced. And yet, despite all his planning, the tiniest slip, a single detail spoken aloud, had undone him. Cole reflected on this as he reviewed the case files late at night. The lesson was clear. Evil is not always loud. Danger is not always obvious. Sometimes, it lives quietly in the background, invisible to everyone, thriving precisely because it is ignored. Evan's trial would later confirm these findings. Psychologists testified that he exhibited traits of obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, coupled with antisocial tendencies. He lacked empathy but was aware of societal norms. His crimes were calculated, deliberate, and devoid of spontaneity. He was methodical to the extreme, yet ultimately human enough to make a single fatal mistake. As the city waited for justice, The story of Evan Miles became a cautionary tale. People learned to look more closely at the ordinary. They learned that evil can wear a mask of normalcy. And they learned that the smallest mistake, something almost imperceptible, can unravel even the most carefully constructed deception. Detective Cole, meanwhile, returned to the scene of the fifth murder one last time. Margaret Hill's apartment had been cleaned, restored to its original state. The lights, once left on by the killer, were now normal. Yet, as he stood in the hallway, Cole couldn't shake the memory of Evan's calm voice, the quiet deliberation in every move, every observation. He realized something he hadn't fully grasped before. Evan's true crime wasn't just the killings themselves. It was the fear he had instilled in the city, the disruption of ordinary life, the knowledge that someone could move unnoticed, unchallenged, and yet be capable of the unthinkable. In a sense, Evan had already won. Even in custody, his presence lingered. The city had changed. People watched, locked doors, hesitated before trusting strangers. Greybridge would never return entirely to the peace it once knew. But Detective Cole took some solace in knowing one thing. Evan Miles had been caught. He had been stopped. And even though his calm, calculated evil had terrorized the city for months, it had ultimately been human error, an ordinary mistake, that ended his reign. Evan sat in his cell, the quietest room he had ever known. No lights on. No one to watch him. Invisible, finally, but not in the way he had intended. The small mistake, the apartment number, had undone him. It was ironic, almost poetic. A man who had killed to assert his presence had been caught by the very thing he thought would never matter. A tiny, unnoticed truth. In the courtroom, as he was led in for sentencing, Evan maintained his calm exterior. He did not resist, did not plead, did not show emotion. Detective Cole watched from the back. He had spent weeks trying to understand this man, to find the cracks in his invisible armor. And finally, he had. The killer who had terrorized an entire city had been defeated not by brute force or elaborate investigation alone, but by the smallest of human errors. The lesson was clear. No matter how careful, how meticulous, or how invisible a person could be, every action carries risk. And sometimes, that risk is all it takes to uncover the truth. Greybridge would take years to heal, and some scars would never fade. But Evan Miles was no longer free. The man who had terrorized the city had been stopped. And Detective Cole, despite the horrors he had witnessed, finally felt a measure of closure. The city had learned a painful truth. Monsters do not always announce themselves. Sometimes, they smile politely, carry tool bags, and fix lights in the hallways. But no matter how quiet, how ordinary, or how invisible, even monsters are human. And humans make mistakes. Evan Miles' mistake, small and almost trivial, had ended a reign of terror. And in that small, ordinary era, Greybridge had found its salvation. The city of Greybridge had changed. The streets no longer felt safe, even during the daytime. Shops that had once left doors unlocked now had heavy chains across them at night. People spoke in whispers, casting suspicious glances at anyone they didn't know. Parents accompanied their children everywhere, even to the corner store. The quiet, peaceful city had been replaced by a place of constant vigilance, all because of a man who could walk through life unnoticed, invisible, until a single tiny error revealed everything. Detective Aaron Cole watched as Evan Miles was escorted into the courthouse for the beginning of his trial. The courtroom was crowded. Families of victims sat on one side, silent and tense, while reporters crowded the other, cameras clicking relentlessly. The tension in the room was almost tangible, like electricity before a storm. Evan walked calmly, expression neutral, as though he were walking down the street rather than entering the place where the fate of his life would be decided. Cole thought back to the first time he had realized Evan was the killer. It had been almost anticlimactic. A slip of knowledge, a small pause during an interview, and suddenly the pieces fell into place. Margaret Hill's apartment number. That one tiny detail had revealed him, a flaw in an otherwise meticulous plan. Evan had been careful, deliberate, and methodical. But no one, no matter how calculated, is perfect. The investigation into Evan's crimes had been exhaustive. Every aspect of his life was examined, from his work history to his daily routines, from his apartment to the buildings he frequented. Surveillance footage had confirmed his movements on the nights of the murders, though always subtle, almost invisible. For weeks, teams of officers had followed him, documenting patterns, watching him enter buildings unchallenged, listening to him interact politely with residents and co-workers. Every movement had been quiet, controlled, normal. And yet, underneath the surface, Evan had been orchestrating terror, studying loneliness, learning habits, and calculating the perfect moments to strike. During the trial, experts testified about Evan's methods. Psychologists described his behavior as obsessive-compulsive with antisocial tendencies. He lacked empathy but understood human behavior with chilling clarity. His crimes were planned, precise, and devoid of randomness. Every victim was carefully chosen, every step thought out. He had studied crime reports, learned from other killers, and meticulously avoided leaving evidence that could identify him. To the outside world, he was unremarkable, ordinary, invisible. That invisibility was his greatest weapon. And yet, despite all his planning, it had been a small, almost trivial mistake that led to his capture. That one pause during questioning, that unintentional disclosure of information he should not have known, had unraveled everything. Margaret Hill's apartment number had been a secret, one only known to police and the killer. Evan had spoken it aloud casually, unaware of its significance. In that moment, his carefully constructed world collapsed. As the trial progressed, Evan remained calm. He spoke only when necessary, answering questions in a quiet, deliberate voice. He never raised his eyes to the courtroom, never reacted to the expressions of the families of his victims. His detachment was unnerving. Cole watched him closely, trying to read any sign of emotion, any hint of remorse. There was none. Evan spoke of his crimes with the same clarity and calmness as if he were describing a routine task at work. He justified his actions not with anger or hatred but with the cold logic of someone who had felt invisible all his life. They never saw me, Evan said during one testimony. People walked past me every day and didn't notice. I was ignored. I just wanted to be acknowledged. If the only way the world would see me was through the lives I took, then that was the way I chose. I gave them attention, the attention they deserved, and I made them permanent. The words hung in the courtroom, chilling in their simplicity. The families of the victims sat frozen, listening as he described the carefully orchestrated terror that had invaded their lives. Cole felt a wave of frustration and anger. He had seen killers before, but Evan's calm, rational approach made his crimes feel even more sinister. There was no chaos, no uncontrolled violence. There was only control, observation, and a cold, deliberate calculation. Cole reflected on how much time had passed before they even suspected Evan. The killer had been living among them, moving through buildings unnoticed, walking past neighbors and co-workers who didn't question his presence. He had been in plain sight, invisible because people had never thought to look for danger where it seemed impossible. Graybridge had helped him hide simply by treating him as ordinary, by ignoring him, by assuming he was harmless. That invisibility had allowed him to operate undetected for months, maybe years. But the tiniest slip had undone him. The apartment number had been enough. The pause, the hesitation, the unintentional reveal of knowledge that only a killer would know had given Detective Cole the lead he needed. Once under surveillance, Evan's movements confirmed what Cole already suspected. He walked calmly, confidently, but always within reach of observation. He never realized that even the smallest detail could expose him. The trial continued with more evidence presented. Surveillance footage, white logs, and forensic reports painted a picture of methodical precision. Phones taken from victims were displayed as evidence, wiped clean but undeniably linked to Evan. His toolkit, containing gloves, sedatives, and cleaning cloths, was presented, demonstrating the meticulous care with which he carried out his crimes. Even the notes found hidden in his apartment, detailing routines and observations of potential victims, were presented as evidence of his planning and obsession. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Evan's demeanor never changed. He remained quiet, detached, almost unaffected by the gravity of his situation. He did not plead. He did not apologize. He did not react. It was as though he had always known he would be caught, that the smallest mistake would be enough to reveal him. Outside the courtroom, the city of Graybridge struggled to come to terms with what had happened. People locked doors they had never locked before. Parents watched their children more closely. Strangers were regarded with suspicion. The city's sense of safety, once so natural and taken for granted, had been shattered. People realized that evil could hide in plain sight, that danger could wear the mask of ordinary life. Detective Cole spent long nights reflecting on the case. He had faced killers before, but Evan Miles had been different. There was no rage, no desperation, no obvious threat. There was only careful, calculated invisibility, and that had been his deadliest weapon. Cole realized that even the most meticulous plans can fail, that even someone who seems untouchable can make a mistake. And in that small, almost imperceptible mistake, the truth is revealed. When the verdict was finally delivered, Evan Miles was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent, heavy with relief and lingering horror. Families of the victims wept quietly, some with relief, others with grief that would never fade. Cole watched as Evan was led away, calm, neutral, still seemingly unaffected. But Cole knew the truth. The man who had terrorized an entire city had been stopped. He had been caught not by luck or brute force, but by the smallest error, the tiniest slip that revealed what had been hidden for so long. As Evan was escorted from the courtroom, Cole thought about the city he had sworn to protect. Greybridge would never return entirely to its previous peace. The fear, the caution, the awareness of danger lurking in the ordinary, would remain. But one lesson was clear. No matter how invisible someone might seem, no matter how careful, meticulous, or controlled, mistakes happen. And when they do, the truth cannot be hidden forever. In his prison cell, Evan Miles finally experienced the invisibility he had craved. Not the kind that allowed him to strike unnoticed, but the kind that stripped him of freedom and power. He was alone, unseen, and utterly powerless. The life he had manipulated, the control he had exercised over the city and its people, was gone. All that remained was the silence he had once sought to escape. Detective Cole, watching Evan settle into confinement, understood the full measure of what had happened. The city had been terrorized by a man who thrived on being ignored. The lessons of the case were stark. Evil does not always announce itself. Danger does not always make noise. And sometimes, it is the smallest, most insignificant mistake that ends the greatest threats. Greybridge slowly began to heal. Residents returned to routines, though more cautiously. Lights were left on at night. Neighbors watched one another a little more closely. Locks were checked twice, doors bolted securely. The city had learned vigilance. And while the memory of Evan Miles would never fully fade, there was a sense of closure, a fragile sense that life could continue despite the terror that had unfolded. In the quiet hours, Detective Cole often thought back to the moments that had led to Evan's capture. The pause during an interview, the apartment number spoken aloud, the seemingly trivial knowledge that had exposed the killer. All of it reminded him that even the most careful, calculated plans can unravel. Human error, as small as it might seem, can have monumental consequences. Evan's story became a cautionary tale in Greybridge. Schools discussed the importance of awareness and vigilance. Community groups organized safety meetings. People shared stories about strangers and neighbors, teaching one another to notice what they might otherwise ignore. The city had been forever changed by the invisible threat that had once walked among them. In the end, the story of Evan Miles was a story of dualities. He was both invisible and seen, careful and flawed, ordinary and monstrous. His downfall came not from brute force, not from luck, but from a detail so small it almost seemed insignificant. And that small mistake reminded the city, and the world, that no matter how meticulous or hidden a person might be, the truth has a way of coming to light. Detective Cole often reflected on this. He knew that evil could wear many faces, some terrifying, some ordinary. But he also knew that vigilance, careful observation, and attention to small details could make a difference. One tiny slip could expose even the most careful predator. And that knowledge, hard-earned and bitter, was perhaps the most important lesson Greybridge had learned from Evan Miles. The city continued, cautious but alive. Streets lit up at night. Neighbors spoke to one another, not just out of friendliness but out of awareness. Children played under watchful eyes. Life returned, but with a lingering awareness that shadows can hide in plain sight, that ordinary people can harbor extraordinary darkness, and that even the smallest mistake can reveal the truth. Evan Miles remained behind bars, his quiet, deliberate calm replaced by the stillness of confinement. And while Graybridge would never forget the terror he had brought, it had also learned a hard lesson. Monsters do not always appear monstrous. Sometimes they look ordinary. Sometimes they are polite. Sometimes they fix lights in apartment hallways, unnoticed by everyone. And sometimes they are finally caught by the smallest mistake of all, a human flaw that no calculation, no meticulous planning, and no mask can ever fully hide. Graybridge had survived. Evan Miles had been stopped. The city learned that vigilance is never wasted, that ordinary observations matter, and that sometimes the world is saved not by extraordinary heroics, but by a tiny, almost imperceptible detail, the smallest human mistake that exposes the truth and ends a reign of terror. And in that understanding, Detective Cole found a measure of peace. Graybridge would heal, slowly and carefully, but it would never forget the lessons of the night watcher, the man who had lived among them, invisible, unnoticed, and only caught by a small mistake.